The leather cracked against bare flesh for the last time on August 15, 1857, in the sweltering heat of Magnolia Grove Plantation, where the air hung thick with humidity and the metallic scent of blood. A slave named Elsa Marie Dubois made a choice that would echo through Louisiana folklore for generations. This is the story of how oppression transforms into fury, and how one woman's breaking point became a symbol of resistance that plantation owners would whisper about in fear. The cypress trees surrounding Magnolia Grove creaked in the morning breeze, their Spanish moss swaying like funeral shrouds. The smell of magnolia blossoms couldn't mask the stench of human suffering that permeated the fields. Beneath calloused fingers, the rough hemp rope that bound cotton bales felt like the chains that bound souls. Elsa had endured Master Charles Beauregard's cruelty for 7 years. At 24, she possessed a quiet dignity that infuriated him and a beauty that he coveted. Born into bondage on a neighboring plantation, she'd been sold to Beauregard after her previous master's death. What she found at Magnolia Grove was a special kind of hell reserved for women who dared to meet their oppressor's gaze without flinching. The plantation records show that Beauregard purchased Elsa for $800 in 1850. What those ledgers don't record is how he systematically broke down every other woman who'd caught his attention. Sarah, who'd thrown herself into the bayou rather than submit. Marie, who'd simply stopped speaking until she wasted away. Elsa watched them all disappear, one by one. But Elsa was different. She possessed something that couldn't be bought or beaten out of her, an unbreakable core of defiance that burned brighter with each humiliation. When Beauregard cornered her in the slave quarters, she found ways to slip away. When he ordered her to his house for special duties, she developed mysterious illnesses. Her resistance was subtle but absolute. The other slaves noticed. They saw how she helped runaways find safe passage through the swamp. They witnessed her tending to wounds that Beauregard's overseer inflicted. Most importantly, they observed how she never bowed her head, even when the whip left fresh marks across her back. Martha, an older slave who'd served the Beauregard family for 30 years, later testified to Union soldiers. That girl had fire in her eyes from the day she arrived. Master Charles, he saw it too, made him want to snuff it out. What would you do if every day brought fresh torment and escape meant certain death? On that humid August morning, Beauregard had reached his limit with Elsa's defiance. She'd been caught teaching slave children to read, using torn pages from a discarded Bible. In 1857 Louisiana, this act carried severe consequences. Beauregard retrieved his favorite punishment tool, a braided leather whip with metal studs that had tasted the blood of countless victims. But this time, something was different. As Beauregard raised the whip, Elsa didn't cower or turn away. Instead, she met his gaze with an intensity that made him pause. In that moment of hesitation, she saw not a master, but a coward hiding behind inherited power and legal brutality. The whip sang through the air, but it never found its target. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because Elsa's tale is just beginning, and what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about courage under impossible circumstances. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plantation grounds as Elsa's fingers closed around leather that had caused so much pain. In her grip, the symbol of oppression was about to become an instrument of liberation. But rebellion, even justified rebellion, carries a price that few are prepared to pay. What Elsa didn't know was that 3 field hands were watching from behind the cotton gin, and their testimony would soon reach ears that could either elevate her to martyrdom or ensure her destruction. Elsa's hand moved faster than thought itself. Charles Beauregard had barely registered the shift in her posture when the whip handle slipped from his grasp like water through fingers. For 7 years, he'd wielded that braided leather as an extension of his will, never imagining it could be turned against him. The weight of absolute power had made him careless, and carelessness, in the presence of the desperate, becomes fatal vulnerability. In that heartbeat between his surprise and her action, the entire foundation of plantation hierarchy cracked like ice under spring sun. The morning heat pressed down on the whitewashed overseer's cabin where this confrontation unfolded. Inside, the smell of tobacco and stale whiskey mingled with something sharper fear. The rough wooden floor, worn smooth by countless boots, would soon bear witness to the kind of justice that courtrooms never dispensed. Beauregard's shock lasted only seconds before rage replaced it. He lunged forward, his face flushed crimson, spittle flying as he screamed words that slaves had heard 1,000 times before. But Elsa had already stepped back. The whip coiled in her hands like a serpent finally awakened to its own power. What happened next defied every social order that Louisiana society was built upon. The master, who owned human beings like livestock, found himself looking up from the floor at a woman he'd legally purchased. The reversal was so complete, so fundamentally wrong according to the laws of 1857, that reality itself seemed to pause. Beauregard scrambled for his feet, his white linen shirt now torn and dirty. He reached for the pistol he kept in his desk drawer, but Elsa was already moving. The whip that had scarred her back, 23 times she'd counted every lash, now wrapped around his throat, with the precision of someone who understood exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end. The field hands watching through the cabin window later described the sound that emerged from Beauregard's throat as something between a whistle and a prayer. Thomas, a blacksmith who'd felt that same whip across his shoulders just days before, would tell investigators that he'd never heard anything more satisfying in his life. Some moments stretch beyond their natural boundaries, expanding to contain entire lifetimes of suffering and rage. Elsa pulled tighter. Every night she'd been forced to submit in silence. Every morning she'd bitten back screams. Every moment of stolen dignity, it all channeled through her arms into that braided leather. Beauregard clawed at the whip around his neck, his fingernails drawing blood from his own skin as he fought for air that wouldn't come. The plantation records from neighboring estates reveal a disturbing pattern. Between 1850 and 1857, Magnolia Grove had purchased 14 women slaves. Of those 14, only 4 remained alive by the time of Beauregard's death. The others had died from accidents, illnesses, or had simply vanished into the bayou, rather than endure another day under his ownership. Elsa knew their names. She whispered each one as she held that whip steady. Sarah, Marie, Catherine, Josephine. The litany of the dead gave her strength as Beauregard's struggles grew weaker. But this act of resistance carried consequences that extended far beyond one man's death. Word traveled fast on plantations, carried by field hands and house servants who moved between properties like living newspapers. By sunset, every slave within 20 miles would know that someone had finally fought back. What they didn't know was that Beauregard's nephew had been riding toward the plantation that morning, arriving just in time to witness the final moments through the cabin window. Young Edmund Beauregard, fresh from law school in New Orleans, watched his uncle die and understood immediately that this moment would require swift and brutal response. In the twisted logic of slavery, allowing Elsa to survive would signal to every enslaved person in Louisiana that resistance was possible. As Charles Beauregard drew his last breath, his eyes bulging with the recognition of his own mortality, Elsa felt something she'd never experienced before. Not relief, not satisfaction, but a profound understanding that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She dropped the whip beside his body and walked to the cabin door. Outside, the August sun continued to beat down on cotton fields, where other slaves pretended not to notice the sudden silence from the overseer's quarters. Some of them were already running toward the swamp, understanding that the coming hours would bring a reckoning that would spare no one. But before the lynch mob could form, before the dogs could be set loose. Elsa had one more choice to make, and it would transform her from victim to symbol in ways that would echo through generations of resistance fighters. Edmund Beauregard's hands trembled as he dismounted his horse, the leather reins slipping through fingers, suddenly slick with sweat. The young lawyer had ridden from New Orleans with business documents and news from the city, expecting to find his uncle preparing for the afternoon's cotton inspection. Instead, through the cabin window, he watched a slave woman release a braided whip that still bore the imprint of his uncle's neck. The legal mind that had graduated summa cum laude from Tulane struggled to process what defied every assumption about power, race, and control in antebellum Louisiana. This moment would determine not just Elsa's fate, but the response of an entire system built on the premise that such resistance was impossible. The humid air inside the overseer's cabin carried the scent of death, and something else, the metallic tang of justice served outside courtroom walls. Rough-hewn timber walls, stained with years of tobacco smoke, had witnessed countless acts of cruelty. Now they contained something unprecedented, a master's corpse and a living slave who had refused to die quietly. Edmund pressed himself against the window frame, his white cotton shirt soaked with perspiration that had nothing to do with Louisiana heat. His legal training told him to summon the sheriff immediately. His survival instincts whispered something different, that this woman who had just strangled his uncle with remarkable efficiency might not hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Through the glass, he watched Elsa kneel beside Charles Beauregard's body, but instead of searching his pockets or attempting to flee, she did something that would haunt Edmund's nightmares for decades to come. She closed the dead man's eyes with a gentleness that spoke of profound humanity, then folded his hands across his chest as if preparing him for burial. The contradiction shattered Edmund's worldview. How could someone capable of calculated murder display such dignity? How could a piece of property, for that's how the law defined her, demonstrate more grace than most white Christians he knew? Parish records from St. Landry show that Edmund Beauregard had witnessed 43 slave auctions by age 22. He'd watched human beings sold like cattle, families torn apart, children separated from mothers. None of it had troubled his sleep. But this act of rebellion, followed by ritualistic respect for the dead, created a cognitive dissonance that would drive him to madness within 5 years. Elsa stood and walked to the cabin door. For a moment, Edmund thought she might escape into the swamp before anyone discovered the body. Instead, she stepped outside and called out in a voice that carried across the plantation grounds, "Master Charles is dead. I killed him with his own whip." The honesty was more terrifying than any threat. Field hands stopped their work. House servants froze in doorways. Even the birds seemed to fall silent as her words echoed across Magnolia Grove. In a society where slaves learned to lie for survival, this naked truth hit like lightning striking dry timber. Edmund realized he was witnessing something beyond simple murder. This was a public declaration of war against the entire institution of slavery. Elsa wasn't just killing her oppressor. She was announcing to every enslaved person within earshot that resistance was possible, that masters could bleed and die like any other man. But her courage would inspire a response, swift and merciless. Within minutes, the plantation bell began tolling not the usual work signals, but the frantic clanging that meant emergency. Edmund watched as white overseers emerged from buildings across the property, their faces showing the same mixture of disbelief and rage that churned in his own stomach. The first to reach the cabin was Jacob Morrison, the head overseer who'd served the Beauregard family for 15 years. His weathered face went white when he saw his employer's body, then purple with rage when he spotted Elsa standing calmly in the doorway. "Get the dogs," Morrison shouted to another overseer. "Send word to every plantation in the parish. This ends today." But even as the machinery of retribution began grinding into motion, something unexpected was happening in the slave quarters. Instead of terror, Edmund detected something that chilled him more than Elsa's confession. Hope spreading like wildfire among faces that had forgotten what hope looked like. Old Martha, who'd served the Beauregard family since before Edmund's birth, looked directly at Elsa and whispered words that would be repeated in slave quarters across Louisiana. "You did what we all dreamed of doing." That whisper contained the seeds of revolution. As Edmund finally found the courage to enter the cabin and examine his uncle's corpse, he discovered something the investigating sheriff would later omit from official records. Clutched in Charles Beauregard's dead hand was a torn piece of paper, a page from the Bible that Elsa had been using to teach slave children to read. The passage was from Exodus, and he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The plantation bell's frantic tolling carried across the Mississippi River Delta like a death knell, reaching ears that had been waiting decades to hear such a sound. By noon on August 15th, 1857, riders were galloping between plantations with news that would reshape how masters slept at night. The message was simple and terrifying. A slave had killed her owner, confessed publicly, and lived long enough to tell about it. In a society built on the fiction that such rebellion was impossible, Elsa's survival represented an existential threat that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. This moment would test whether the institution of slavery could survive the revelation of its own mortality. The dusty roads between plantations churned under horses' hooves as word spread faster than summer wildfire. The air filled with the sound of galloping and shouted commands, while Spanish moss hung like funeral veils from ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of human bondage. Under calloused fingers, loaded muskets felt heavier than usual, as white men confronted their deepest fear, that their property might decide to fight back. At Riverside Plantation, 10 miles south, Master William Thornton received the news while reviewing his ledgers. The leather-bound book in his hands contained the names and values of 83 human beings he owned outright. After hearing about Elsa's rebellion, those names suddenly looked less like assets and more like potential threats. Thornton's first action revealed the terror that Elsa's deed had unleashed. He ordered every slave on his property confined to quarters immediately, posted armed guards at every building, and sent his wife and children to New Orleans on the next riverboat. His actions were replicated across St. Landry Parish as masters realized that their authority rested not on divine right, but on the collective submission of people who outnumbered them 10 to 1. But in the slave quarters across Louisiana, a different conversation was taking place. The Underground Railroad's Louisiana network received confirmation of Elsa's action through channels that moved information faster than any telegraph. Harriet Redmond, a free woman of color who ran a safe house in New Orleans, later wrote to abolitionists in Philadelphia. Word came that a sister had finally done what we all whispered about in our prayers. The effect was electric. Every chain felt lighter. Every master seemed smaller. What would you do if you learned that the impossible had become possible, that someone like you had struck back and lived to claim it? At Magnolia Grove, Elsa waited. She had barricaded herself in the overseer's cabin with her master's corpse, his loaded pistol, and a decision that surprised even her supporters. Instead of fleeing to the swamp where she might have evaded capture for months, she chose to make her stand in the place where her rebellion began. Through the cabin's single window, she watched the gathering storm. By mid-afternoon, more than 40 white men had assembled in the plantation yard, their faces flushed with heat and righteous anger. They carried rope, torches, and the unshakable conviction that swift justice would restore the natural order that Elsa had so violently disrupted. Sheriff William Landry arrived from Opelousas with a legal warrant and a profound understanding that this case would define his career. At 38, he'd presided over dozens of slave trials, all of which ended predictably. But Elsa's public confession and her refusal to flee created legal complications that kept him awake at night. Louisiana law in 1857 was explicit. Slaves who killed their masters faced mandatory execution. But the law also required a trial, witnesses, and due process concepts that seemed absurd when applied to property destroying its owner. The contradiction exposed the fundamental insanity of treating humans as objects while simultaneously holding them responsible for their actions. Inside the cabin, Elsa had found something she'd never possessed before: time to think without fear. She used those hours to write something that would outlast her life by generations. Using charcoal from the fireplace and pages torn from Charles Beauregard's business ledgers, she began documenting the names and stories of slaves who had died under his ownership. Her handwriting, taught in secret by a house servant who'd learned from the master's children, was precise and beautiful. Sarah threw herself in the bayou rather than bear his child. Marie stopped eating when he sold her son to Mississippi. Catherine tried to run and was dragged behind a horse until she died. Beneath each name, she wrote a single word: remembered. The mob outside grew restless as afternoon stretched toward evening. Someone shouted about rope and trees, but Sheriff Landry maintained that legal procedure must be followed. His insistence on due process wasn't motivated by justice. It was a desperate attempt to maintain the fiction that slavery operated within civilized boundaries. As sunset approached, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Elsa made a choice that would transform her from killer to martyr. She opened the cabin door and walked out to face her accusers, carrying something in her hands that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. But what she carried and what she said to the assembled crowd would ensure that her name lived on long after the rope finished its work. Elsa emerged from the overseer's cabin carrying Charles Beauregard's leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with the monetary value he'd assigned to human lives. The assembled crowd of 43 white men fell silent as she walked toward them with the measured pace of someone who had already made peace with death. In her other hand, she clutched the charcoal-stained pages where she'd written the names of the forgotten dead. What she said next would be repeated in slave quarters and abolitionist meetings from Louisiana to Massachusetts, transforming a local act of resistance into a rallying cry that transcended state lines. Her words would prove more dangerous to the institution of slavery than any weapon ever forged. The evening air hung thick with humidity and tension, cicadas providing a discordant soundtrack to this unprecedented confrontation. The smell of torches, mixed with human sweat and fear, created an atmosphere that felt charged with violence. Under the rough hemp of hastily tied nooses, the bark of the ancient oak tree felt like the skin of something already dead. Sheriff Landry stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol grip. Protocol demanded that he arrest Elsa and transport her to the parish jail for trial, but the mob's energy suggested that legal niceties would be abandoned before the sun set completely. He'd witnessed enough lynchings to recognize the signs: the shortened breathing, the muttered curses, the way men's hands kept checking their weapons. Elsa stopped 10 feet from the crowd and opened the ledger. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the plantation grounds with startling clarity. Charles Beauregard bought me for $800 in 1850. He paid $900 for Sarah before he drove her to suicide. Marie cost him $750 before she starved herself rather than submit to his desires. The recitation of prices and names created an uncomfortable silence. These men understood the economics of slavery, but hearing the figures spoken by the property itself violated an unspoken rule about maintaining comfortable distance between owner and owned. Edmund Beauregard, still reeling from witnessing his uncle's death, shouted from the back of the crowd, "She's lying. She murdered a good Christian man." Elsa's response would be recorded in multiple eyewitness accounts and later published in northern newspapers. "I killed a man who treated human beings like livestock and thought his money gave him the right to use our bodies as he pleased. If that makes me a murderer, then every master in Louisiana stands guilty of the same crime." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, But Elsa continued speaking, her voice rising above the noise. "You want to hang me for defending myself against rape and torture. Fine. But remember that your wives and daughters know what their men do in the slave quarters. They know, and they say nothing. What does that make them? Death comes in many forms." That accusation struck deeper than any physical blow. In the rigid social structure of antebellum Louisiana, white women's moral purity depended on their ignorance of their husbands' and fathers' sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Elsa's words threatened to expose the hypocrisy that allowed respectable society to function. Several men reached for their rope, but Sheriff Landry raised his hand. Legal training overcame mob instinct as he recognized that Elsa's public statements were creating a record that would reach beyond Louisiana if she died without trial. Northern abolitionists would seize on her words as evidence of slavery's moral corruption. "You'll have your trial," Landry announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "Due process will be followed." But the crowd's bloodlust had been awakened by Elsa's defiance. A voice from the mob called out, "Since when does property get a trial?" The question exposed the fundamental contradiction that Elsa had been highlighting. Slaves were simultaneously property, and people, objects and moral agents, possessions and criminals. The legal system couldn't resolve this paradox without acknowledging slavery's inherent insanity. Elsa understood that her trial would be a sham, but she also recognized an opportunity to speak truths that had been silenced for generations. She looked directly at Edmund Beauregard and delivered words that would haunt him until his death in 1862. "Your uncle kept detailed records of what he did to us. Every assault, every humiliation. Check his desk drawer if you want to know who the real criminal was." That statement sent Edmund running toward the overseer's cabin. What he found in Charles Beauregard's private papers would drive him to become one of Louisiana's most vocal critics of slavery, and eventually to his own destruction by former friends who couldn't forgive his change of heart. As torches were lit against the gathering darkness, Elsa made one final statement that transformed her from victim to symbol. "Kill me if you must, but know that my death will inspire others. We remember every kindness and every cruelty. We remember every name and every face. And someday, someone will remember mine." The rope tightened around her neck at exactly 9:47 that evening, but her prophecy had already begun fulfilling itself in ways that would reshape American history. The hemp rope creaked against the oak tree's ancient branch as Elsa's body swayed in the humid Louisiana night, but her death marked the beginning rather than the end of her story. Within hours of the lynching, field hands across 3 parishes were singing a song that hadn't existed. The day before, a work chant that seemed innocent to white ears, but carried coded messages about resistance, remembrance, and the name of a woman who had shown them that masters could die. The Underground Railroad's network pulsed with news that traveled faster than any horse, transforming a local execution into a rallying cry that would reach slave quarters from Texas to Virginia. Elsa's death had lit a fuse that would burn for generations, igniting courage in places where hope had seemed impossible. The morning after the lynching brought an eerie quiet to Magnolia Grove, where the smell of burned rope lingered in air thick with August heat. And something else, the metallic scent of change that made white overseers check their weapons twice before leaving their houses. The rough bark of the hanging tree bore new scars where someone had carved a single word during the night. Remembered. No one saw who did it, but everyone knew what it meant. Sheriff Landry discovered the carving during his morning inspection and felt a chill despite the rising temperature. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd overseen countless slave executions without losing sleep. But this case felt different. Elsa's public defiance had created ripples that he couldn't control, spreading through communities he couldn't monitor. The first sign of trouble came from neighboring plantations, where masters reported unusual behavior among their slaves. Work songs carried new verses that seemed to reference recent events. Field hands exchanged meaningful glances when discussing rope and trees. Most disturbing of all, Several overseers reported that slaves were meeting their eyes directly instead of maintaining the downcast gaze that signaled proper submission. At Riverside Plantation, Master William Thornton confronted his house servant about the changes he'd observed. Old Moses, who'd served the Thornton family for 40 years, gave him an answer that would haunt his dreams. Some things change when folks see that impossible ain't always impossible. Master William, the coded language of resistance, spread like wildfire through Louisiana's slave communities. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, free people of color were organizing something unprecedented. Led by Harriet Redmond, a network of activists began documenting Elsa's story with an accuracy that would later astonish historians. They collected eyewitness accounts, preserved her final words, and most importantly, began spreading her name through channels that connected Louisiana to the broader abolitionist movement. Redmond's letter to Frederick Douglass, dated August 20th, 1857, captured the moment's significance. A sister has shown us that the Master's power rests on our acceptance of it. Her death proves that even martyrdom can be a form of victory if it awakens others to their own strength. But Elsa's influence reached beyond organized resistance movements. In slave quarters across the South, mothers began telling their children bedtime stories about a woman who fought back and died free. These stories, passed down through oral tradition, would survive long after legal emancipation. Young Samuel, a 12-year-old slave on a Mississippi cotton plantation, later recalled, "My grandmother told me about Elsa every night for months after she died. Said she wanted me to know that being scared and being brave could live in the same heart." The stories evolved with each telling, but certain elements remained constant. Elsa's refusal to submit, her public confession, her final words about remembrance. These details became touchstones for enslaved people seeking examples of dignified resistance. Some names become legends. Edmund Beauregard's investigation of his uncle's papers revealed documentation that supported every accusation Elsa had made. Charles Beauregard had indeed kept detailed records of his sexual assaults, complete with dates, descriptions, and his twisted justifications. The discovery drove Edmund to a nervous breakdown that lasted 6 months. When he recovered, Edmund began writing letters to northern newspapers detailing the horrors he'd discovered and calling for slavery's immediate abolition. His transformation from plantation heir to abolitionist created a scandal that destroyed his family's social standing and ultimately led to his exile from Louisiana. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Elsa's impact came from an unexpected source. In October 1857, 2 months after her death, 3 slaves escaped from plantations within 50 miles of Magnolia Grove. When captured, all 3 carried small pieces of rope tied around their wrists, a symbol that investigators couldn't understand, but that sent chills through the slave-owning community. The rope bracelets represented a new form of resistance, the transformation of a symbol of oppression into a badge of defiance. Elsa's execution had inadvertently created a rallying sign that would appear on slave rebellions across the South for the next 5 years. As 1857 drew to a close, plantation owners throughout Louisiana faced a troubling reality. Their authority, once unquestioned, now seemed fragile. Every interaction with their slaves carried the possibility that another Elsa might emerge, choosing death over submission and inspiring others through her sacrifice. But the true measure of Elsa's legacy wouldn't be revealed until war came to Louisiana, bringing with it opportunities for the kind of large-scale resistance that her solitary act of defiance had foreshadowed. The first Union gunboat appeared on the Mississippi River near Magnolia Grove on April 28, 1862, its steam whistle echoing across water that reflected smoke from burning cotton warehouses. 4 years and 8 months had passed since Elsa's execution, but her name still circulated through slave quarters like a prayer for deliverance. When blue uniformed soldiers finally reached Louisiana's plantation country, they discovered that rebellion had been simmering beneath the surface long before their arrival. The woman who had died for striking back against her oppressor had become a symbol that transformed individual desperation into collective resistance. The Civil War would reveal how deeply Elsa's example had taken root in Louisiana's enslaved communities. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with river mud as Union forces established their foothold along the Mississippi. Wooden docks, weathered by decades of slave-produced cargo shipments, now groaned under the weight of artillery pieces aimed at the heart of Confederate Louisiana. Under calloused fingers that had picked cotton for generations, muskets felt surprisingly familiar tools of liberation rather than oppression. When Colonel James Morrison's regiment occupied the ruins of Magnolia Grove, they found the plantation already abandoned by its white owners, but still inhabited by former slaves who had nowhere else to go. Among them was Martha, now 73 years old and nearly blind, who had witnessed Elsa's final confrontation with Charles Beauregard. Martha's testimony, recorded by Union Chaplain William Hayes on May 15, 1862, provided historians with the most detailed account of Elsa's death. That girl knew she was going to die, but she wasn't afraid. She told us her name would live on, and she was right. Every time we heard about slaves fighting back somewhere else, we'd say, "That's Elsa's spirit moving through them." The Union Army discovered that Elsa's influence had spread far beyond Louisiana. Escaped slaves joining their ranks carried stories about the woman who had strangled her master with his own whip. These accounts had evolved through 4 years of retelling, but they maintained their essential power, the knowledge that resistance was possible, even unto death. Sergeant Robert Blake, a formerly enslaved man from Alabama, told Union officers, "We all knew about Louisiana Elsa. Her story kept us going when things got darkest. If she could stand up to her master, we could find ways to fight back too." The stories had inspired concrete action throughout the war years. Intelligence reports revealed that slaves across the Deep South had been using Elsa's name as a code word for escape attempts. Going to see Elsa meant joining the Underground Railroad. Elsa's calling signified plans for resistance or rebellion. Confederate authorities had banned the use of her name in slave quarters, but enforcement proved impossible when the symbol had become embedded in oral tradition. Captain Samuel Bradford, a Union intelligence officer, documented the phenomenon in his field reports. The enemy's slaves have elevated this woman to the status of folk hero. Her example appears to have undermined Confederate morale among the enslaved population more effectively than any military action we could have taken. But the most powerful testament to Elsa's lasting influence came from an unexpected source. When Union forces captured Edmund Beauregard in New Orleans, they found him working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, using his family's wealth to fund escape routes for runaway slaves. Edmund's interrogation revealed the full scope of his transformation from plantation heir to abolitionist. He had spent 5 years documenting and publishing his uncle's crimes, using Charles Beauregard's own records to expose the sexual violence that pervaded slavery. His testimony before Congress in 1863 would help shape Reconstruction policies. Some deaths echo forever. "I saw her kill him," Edmund told Union investigators. "But more importantly, I saw how her courage spread to others. She proved that masters were mortal, that the system could be challenged." Everything that followed the escapes, the rebellions, the resistance, it all traced back to that August evening when she refused to submit. The Union Army's liberation of Louisiana's plantation country revealed the extent of covert resistance that had flourished since Elsa's death. Weapons caches hidden in slave quarters, elaborate communication networks between plantations, and detailed intelligence about Confederate troop movements, all coordinated by people who had been inspired by a woman who chose death over submission. When Martha died peacefully in her sleep in 1864, she was buried beneath the same oak tree where Elsa had been hanged. The burial was attended by more than 200 formerly enslaved people, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to pay their respects to the woman who had preserved Elsa's memory. On Martha's crude wooden gravestone, someone had carved a simple inscription. "She remembered, so we could be free. As 1865 approached and emancipation became reality across the South, Elsa's story took on new meaning. She was no longer just a symbol of resistance. She had become a founding mother of freedom, a woman whose sacrifice had helped birth a new understanding of human dignity and the right to self-defense. But even freedom couldn't erase the scars that slavery had left on American society, and Elsa's legacy would continue evolving long after the last Confederate soldier surrendered. The granite marker, erected in 1967, stood where the hanging tree had once cast its shadow, bearing a simple inscription that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. Elsa Marie Dubois. She chose freedom over submission. The civil rights movement had rediscovered her story through oral histories collected by activists documenting Black resistance throughout American history. What began as whispered tales in slave quarters had evolved into published accounts that inspired a new generation of freedom fighters who recognized in Elsa's defiance the same courage that fueled their own struggles against oppression. Her death had become a bridge connecting the brutality of slavery to the ongoing fight for human dignity and justice. The humid Louisiana air still carried the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with river mud, but the landscape around the former magnolia grove had transformed beyond recognition. Where cotton fields once stretched to the horizon, suburban developments now housed families whose children learned Elsa's story in integrated schools that would have been unthinkable in 1857. Under fingers that had never known bondage, history textbooks felt lighter than the chains their ancestors had worn. Dr. Angela Washington, a historian from Southern University, led the effort to commemorate Elsa's story during the centennial of her death. Her research had uncovered documents that confirmed details preserved in oral tradition for over a century, validating the accuracy of stories passed down through generations of formerly enslaved families. Washington's 1967 book, The Whip That Broke, Elsa Dubois, and the Spirit of Resistance, revealed the full scope of Elsa's influence on American history. Union Army records, previously sealed in military archives, documented how her story had spread through slave communities and inspired resistance activities throughout the Civil War. The book's most startling revelation came from Confederate intelligence reports that had tracked the use of Elsa's name as a resistance symbol. General Pierre Beauregard, Charles Beauregard's distant cousin, had issued orders in 1863 forbidding any mention of the Louisiana woman in occupied territories, recognizing that her legend was undermining Confederate authority among enslaved populations. But Elsa's legacy extended beyond historical documentation into living memory. When Dr. Washington interviewed descendants of Magnolia Grove's former slaves, she discovered that Elsa's story had been preserved with remarkable consistency across multiple family lines. Mary Jones, whose great-grandmother had witnessed the lynching, shared family accounts that had been passed down through 4 generations. My great-grandmother always said Elsa knew she was going to die, but she wanted her death to mean something. She wanted us to remember that we were human beings, not property, and that we had the right to defend ourselves. The name becomes immortal. The civil rights movement embraced Elsa as a predecessor whose sacrifice had anticipated their own struggles. During the 1964 Freedom Summer, volunteers carried copies of her story as they registered voters across Mississippi and Louisiana. Her example of choosing death over submission resonated with activists facing violence for demanding basic human rights. John Lewis, speaking at the dedication of Elsa's memorial, connected her story to contemporary struggles. She showed us that freedom isn't given, it's taken, sometimes at the cost of everything we hold dear, but taken nonetheless. Every person who refuses to accept injustice carries forward the spirit that lived in Elsa Dubois. Modern genealogical research revealed that Elsa's influence had spread through bloodlines as well as inspiration. DNA testing in the 21st century identified dozens of families across the South who carried genetic markers linking them to slaves who had escaped from Louisiana plantations between 1857 and 1865, the years when her story was spreading most actively through resistance networks. These discoveries suggested that Elsa's courage had literally helped create new family lines by inspiring escapes that allowed enslaved people to find freedom and establish relationships that would have been impossible under bondage. The final testament to her enduring influence came from an unexpected source. In 2008, construction workers renovating buildings in New Orleans' French Quarter discovered a cache of letters hidden in the walls of what had once been a safe house on the Underground Railroad. Among the documents was a letter dated December 15, 1859, written by Harriet Redmond to Frederick Douglass. The letter's final paragraph captured the essence of Elsa's legacy. Her name has become a prayer among our people. When children ask if freedom is possible, their mothers tell them about Elsa. When men wonder if resistance is worth the risk, they remember her courage. She died, but her spirit multiplies with each person who refuses to accept oppression. Elsa's story had transcended individual heroism to become something larger, a symbol of the human capacity to choose dignity over survival, principle over safety, and freedom over life itself. Even today, visitors to the memorial report hearing whispers in the Louisiana wind, carrying what sounds like a woman's voice, saying the names of the forgotten dead, ensuring that their stories, like hers, will never truly die. They say that on August nights, when the humidity hangs thick and the magnolia blossoms bloom white as hope, you can still hear the crack of leather, not the sound of oppression, but of chains breaking forever. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.